Today's homily is called When to Fish Elsewhere, or 15,232, which I will explain later. Two of today's readings are familiar to many people. The first one that attracted my attention was a famous passage of Paul, who then called Saul, on his way to Damascus to continue his passionate work of ferreting out disciples of Jesus. You can see the dramatic picture here. This is from Acts 9, 1-6. Now as he was going along and approaching Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" He asked, "Who are you, Lord?" The reply came, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But get up and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." The men who were traveling with him stood speechless because they heard the voice but saw no one. Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him to Damascus. For 3 days he was without sight, and neither ate nor drank. In the scriptures, there's no mention of horses, but it's much more dramatic, so most people think that horses are in the story. Saul had been such a zealous and passionate persecutor of the new sect of Christians. It took days of blindness, the leader having to be led by his companions, his having to be physically healed by one of Jesus' disciples, where literally his whole life, his own belief system to which he had so rigidly adhered, was turned upside down. It had happened in such a dramatic and sudden manner that he must have had no doubt that this was a very personal and powerful message from God, which meant leaving no room or doubt for dissent. Sometimes the change is a bit less dramatic, but nonetheless quite clear. Now let us go to the Gospel reading from John, a post-resurrection account of Jesus visiting his disciples on the shores of Galilee before his ascension into heaven. To place this in context, when Jesus had been crucified, in this account from John, the latest canonical gospel written around 90 Common Era, over half a century after Jesus was killed, 5 of his former disciples, including Peter, had returned north to Galilee, where they had taken up again their lives as fishermen living on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, a large freshwater lake. Now we hear from John 21, verses 1-14, the New Revised Standard Version. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, another name for the Sea of Galilee, and he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas, called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, "I'm going fishing." They said to him, "We will go with you." They went out and got into the boat, but all night they were able to catch nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" They answered him in a discouraging voice, "No." Here you can see Jesus walking up to the tired and very discouraged fishermen, dragging in their empty nets that still needed to be cleaned. He said to them, "Cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So without question they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord!" When Simon Peter heard it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from land, only about 100 yards off. When they'd gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there already with fish on it, and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. They too had been fishing not only on the wrong side of the boat, but evidently the time as disciples of Jesus had not really ended when they had mistakenly thought they had to go back to Galilee to become fishermen again to support their families. So here we have two stories from the Christian scriptures, elaborating the same theme. Sometimes we set our feet firmly on a path and keep on going at it, like Paul, expanding his search all the way to Damascus to find and kill the new disciples of Jesus. Like the fishermen continuing to cast their nets again and again into the sea, each time all night coming up with nothing, except perhaps more calluses and more hunger as the day drew to a close. In both cases, Paul's story is a bit more dramatic, with future dramatists throwing in the horses so he had further to fall, and the disciples as well. They had to change course dramatically and immediately. They had given it their best shot, but when Jesus was crucified and their dreams continuing to travel him were shattered, they had returned to Galilee and had again taken up fishing, although on this particular day they caught nothing, not even a stray fish or two to take back to their waiting and expectant and hungry families. What they both have in common is that they would have just kept doing the same things over and over and over again because it was what they knew. It basically took divine intervention to break the hard grasp on their lives they were leading. So now there is where that mystical number of 15,232 comes in, for my part, to learn about in this story. It's how many people live in Mills County in southwestern Iowa. It all started when we moved here in 2009, and suddenly for the first time in my life, I actually had more land than I had ever had before. Plenty of room for an orchard, a vegetable garden, nut trees lining the street. There was even an old cistern and a water pump in the barn. My dreams grew and grew and grew as I planted more and more each year. The food bank in the town, the master gardeners had begun a large vegetable garden outside our small town to supply fresh produce, and all of it went to them. Then one day, several years ago, for reasons not shared with me, they stopped. My math went like this. 3 acres untilled, plus me, a former master gardener and professional gardener, equals feeding hundreds of people on my own. So I began the garden, the expenses, the effort, expanding every year with no end in sight. Every summer, I was able to take 20 to 40 pounds of produce to the local church every Wednesday, with more than enough left over for us. I did try to involve others, so I talked with fellow members of the Ministerial Alliance, produced a poster for them to use to encourage their congregants to plant more of the food pantry, even went to a master gardener staff meeting to try to convince them to plant and maintain fruit trees in town for free produce. But I still expected myself to try harder and harder and harder every year. Last year, however, was the beginning of a very painful turnaround. I had planted literally hundreds of squash and cucumbers from seed, but for some reason they grew fine but did not produce much fruit. None from the hundreds of squash, a handful of cucumbers at best. The blossoms were not getting fertilized. Then, for the first time, the bugs and grasshoppers hit in droves, chewing many of my plants to the ground. This year continued, the spring suddenly refusing to come on schedule, postponing my planting times. I misplaced close to $100 worth of seeds I had optimistically purchased in the fall, and they're still missing in action. What had started out as a joy had, over the years, slowly turned into a curse, and I found myself going deeply into depression. My sense of what I truly felt was mine to do, feed all 15,232 residents solely by myself, was no longer something, however, that brought me the joy or even the ability to do. Then I remembered a spiritual advisor years ago reminding me when my dreams had become too grandiose. The Messiah already came, and you are not him. So like Paul, probably just as graciously, I finally yielded. My attempts at being a Christian Superman or Lone Ranger bit the dust. So I will now have a much smaller garden, work more in my writing, continue to support our Kikuyu family and friend Kenya, and continue to remind myself that I alone cannot save the world, that I am also worthy of recreation and recreation and joy, and that I am a member of a large body of people of all faith traditions who live together larger lives in their own private joys and tribulations. So take a breath. Remember how Paul and the disciples both had to change course. If you become too burdensome and fruitless, so with God's help, they all self-corrected and changed course to the way they were truly meant to follow Jesus. My hope for you today is that you take these three stories of Paul, the disciples, and me to heart and reassess where you are in your life, what is essential, what is joyous, what you just might need to let go. Peace.
And that's